A very, very good evening. A warm welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, and welcome to the last few hours of November. Can't quite get my head around this. It is December tomorrow, and already the Nickel household looks like a rather garish American department store. Mrs. Nickel has gone mad with the Christmas decorations, and if there was any hope that we might somehow avoid load shedding this Christmas, I'm afraid it is gone with the 26 kilometers of Christmas lights we appear to have stretched out and around the house. What it does mean, though, is that there is much festive celebration on the horizon. And over the next few weeks, as we wrap up Dan Really Likes Wine with Norman Goodfellows for 2023, we'll be looking back at wines that have stood out during the year past, but also getting a feel for wines that can light up your South African festive celebrations. Wines that can both deal with the heat of summer, but can also play off some of the more traditional and classic Christmas indulgences around the dinner table, be it a turkey, a gammon. A braai is fairly South African over Christmas, and so a lot of wines will fall into that particular space. And that takes us rather nicely into today's show. Now, earlier this year, I spent a bit of time in Elgin visiting one or two of the wineries, catching up with some of the winemakers. It's always a difficult thing to do when you've only got a day or so, because there are so many people you want to go and visit. And when, as I was, you are bound somewhat by the constraints of also working at the Cape Epic, you don't get to see quite as many people as you do. But from those that I did, and from the conversations I've had around both Elgin and around the varietal we celebrate today, there has been an awful lot of very positive chat about South African Chardonnay, and to dial it down a little, to Elgin Chardonnay. And so that is today's celebration, the rise and rise and rise, the charge of Chardonnay out of Elgin. And we've spoken about it through the prism of Paul Clüver with the launch of the Seven Flags not that long ago. But today we go a little wider and canvass some opinion from a little further afield. We will touch on the Paul Clüver space with Emile Joubert, who has become something very regular on the show, and very happily so. We'll talk to Andrew Gunn from up at the top of the hill at Iona. You'll be well acquainted, no doubt, with the magic of their Sauvignon Blanc, but Chardonnay is a space that is so definitively Elgin at the moment. We'll get Andrew's thoughts on that space. We also find somebody on today's show doesn't even live in Elgin, but loves it so much he brings in grapes for his wine. And Neil Ellis joins us on the show, one of the all-time greats of South African winemaking. And then Sarah Duplessis also joins us, not just with an eye on the wines of Richard Kershaw, but also a recent visit by a horde, I think that's the collective noun one uses, of masters of wine who from all over the world descended upon South Africa and included in their visit some time gulping down gallons of Chardonnay very happily in Elgin and reporting back very positively on the experience. So all of that comes together as a look into Elgin and the Chardonnay that is playing such an important part in one of South Africa's key winemaking areas, and is getting a growing army of fans taking notice right around the world. So that is today's show, that celebration of Elgin, with some very special guests. Before we meet them, though, let's have a quick look at some wine news. This is the Albert Frost Trio, led by Albert Frost, who for many years has been at the side of the great Arno Carstens. Marathi's been having a lot going on from a cultural perspective this year. They've had festivals, they've had gatherings, they've had cultural experiences, and the Albert Frost Trio will be playing on the 9th of December. That's next Saturday before you reach for your calendar. Tickets are 295 rand. It'll be a really good evening. Albert Frost, he's one of those guys, he's perhaps not quite as well known in broader music circles as the kind of guys who sit in the top 5 on the pop-centric radio stations. But if you ask any of the top musicians in the country, his is a name that comes very, very quickly to mind. And that's because he just is one of our most talented musicians, spoken of as the South African Jimi Hendrix. For many, your 295 rand includes a welcome drink when you arrive. Kicks off at 11 o'clock. There's lunch from 12 o'clock. The music starts at 1 o'clock, and there'll be both the Mirati Farm Kitchen and Mirati Wines together. So terrific music in a lovely space with food and wine to match. Head over to Mirati's website to grab yourself some tickets and go and join Albert Frost, Scott Gilbert, and John O'Sweetman at Mirati next Saturday. I'll then pop the bubbles at Bon Courage, taking you now out to Robertson. That's this Saturday. Gee, your weekends are going to be busy. Bon Courage will give you a welcome gift, a glass and bubbles on arrival, and it is your chance to celebrate with not just the bubbles, but oysters and live music over a very lazy Saturday in Robertson. I think most Saturdays in Robertson are relatively lazy, but this one will be particularly so in the very best kind of way. Tickets at Web Tickets, 200 Rand per person. Kick them off 10 o'clock till 5 o'clock on Saturday. Pop the bubbles at Bon Courage. And then our evening of music and wine at Jolly Good Carols. This is next Thursday. The guys from Fat Bastard and Robertson Winery will be part of an evening that also includes Craig Hines from Watershed. Now, Craig has made his own wine to go with his own music. His music is terrific. I'm a shameless fan. I love Watershed, love Craig. I've hosted a number of their concerts over the years. They're just such good artists. In fact, I've even tried out one of their music videos. I failed, but we had a lot of fun with it for the Dan Nichols show a few years ago. And we'll be singing with Craig and some other guests and raising some money for a very good cause. Jump Kids, kids who have had issues with limbs and amputations and prosthetics, and this is a charity that gives them a helping hand. And this is open to everybody from 6 o'clock at Royal Johannesburg. Tickets at Norman Goodfellows. Come and join some Christmas karaoke at Royal Johannesburg for our Jolly Good Carols next Thursday. All right, so there we go. Lots to put into the diary. It's a busy end of the year. It's a busy end of the year on the show. We've got over the next few weeks various people looking back at our wine year. Amongst them, Gareth Ferreira will be joining us from Core in London. We'll have Mike Radcliffe summing things up from a Stellenbosch perspective. Doubtless Greg Sherwood on the show. Maybe Lambert's joining us in a couple of weeks' time. We'll also have some of the Norman Goodfellows team, where I want to find out what people have been buying and drinking this year. Does it match with what I've been buying and drinking, or is it a little different? So a nice collective summary of the year ahead. Next Monday's show will be from Leopard Creek at part of the Alfred Dunhill Championship. So busy stretch to go and a busy festive period ahead, one you'll need to stock up on. And I think by the end of today's show, you'll be putting Elgin Chardonnay pretty high up on your shopping list for your next trip to Norman Goodfellows. So let's meet our guest today as we look at this explosion of Chardonnay out of Elgin. Andrew Gunn joins us from Iona. Andrew, a very, very warm welcome. Lovely to have you on the show. Neil Ellis joined us. Lovely to have Neil on as well. Such an iconic name in South African wine. Emile Joubert joins us as a regular, speaking partly from the perspective of Paul Clüver, but also giving us a sense of this rise of South African Chardonnay. And then Sarah Duplessis joins us as well with a couple of caps on. Guys, welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us, and lovely to have you all on at a really exciting time for Elgin. And Andrew, I think every time I do come down to Elgin, there is something exciting going on, because it seems to be a very dynamic part of the world. But the explosion of Chardonnay just over the last few years, from colloquiums happening to Chardonnays from the valley getting onto international lists and finding a way into top restaurants. This combination of Elgin and Chardonnay, which I think was always well set to do okay, has just seemed to have really gone right out the park over the last few years and settled in a very special space, Andrew.
Yes, Dan. Chardonnay is as you know, the traditional home of Chardonnay is Burgundy. And I think, it came out, I believe the De Wets were the first people to plant Chardonnay in South Africa. I understand the stockies were actually smuggled out. It's a relatively late arrival to the South African wine scene. And so is, in fact, Elgin. Elgin, in fact, is relatively new, although there were grapes planted at the early part of the last century, and the Clüvers were the first people to put up a cellar here. I think that's 30 odd years ago. I bought my farm in 1997. I lived in Joburg, and I bought what I thought was a viable apple farm. And I did independent climate research and came to the conclusion that we had a climate somewhere between Sancerre and Burgundy. And in fact, I visited Professor Eben Archer. He was Professor of Viticulture at Stellenbosch. And he said to me, Andrew, I'm sorry to disappoint you. There's no such vineyard or climate like as that in South Africa. South Africa is a warm to hot wine growing region. And I think it was borne out by today, for example. I mean, the temperatures around the wine regions were between 35 and 40, whereas in Elgin it was relatively cool. So Chardonnay is, although it's a cool climate variety, it is also, and Neil will probably tell us more about that, it's also a winemaker's grape. So it can be influenced quite strongly in the cellar in terms of when you pick your lees contact, your new oak regime, and so on and so forth, how often you stir the lees. But in Elgin, we've got this very special climate that we are able to ripen grapes physiologically at low sugar levels, which means that our wines become totally ripe. The need to pick early, or for that matter, wait until they're ripe when you've got 14 plus alcohol. And then, of course, what happens as the alcohol and sugar rises in grapes, the acid drops out. So we've got this fantastic climate to produce, real classic Chardonnays, cool climate Chardonnays, beautiful low alcohols, lovely acidity. We tend to get a limey note rather than a heavy white, or more white fruit, I would say, rather than the yellow fruit spectrum. So yeah, I think Elgin Chardonnay is, and the Master of Wines you mentioned earlier on, there was no doubt. In fact, the closing address by one of the MWs was that, Elgin is really on the rise, particularly with the advent of Burgundy, which is getting hotter, and the prices of Burgundy are going through the roof. So I think that, to get it, I was in fact negotiating with my importer this morning about a price increase for next year, the UK importer. And good Burgundies are hard to get. And a good bottle of Burgundy is 40 to 50 pounds in the UK, whereas you can get a good Elgin Chardonnay for between 25 and 30. So yeah, I think I'm very excited. Obviously, I'm biased, Dan. But I think the proof of the pudding's in the eating, and I think there is a strong move towards recognizing that Elgin is really this wonderful climate for. In fact, I believe we can produce ripen any grape, but specifically cool climate grapes like Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, and Pinot Noir.
We're not for a minute going to accept that suggestion that you're anything other than completely impartial when it comes to Elgin, Andrew. That sets the scene rather nicely. What endorses this scene is not just the Masters of Wine, who we'll chat about with Sarah in a moment or two, but the fact that other South Africans and rather well-known and celebrated South Africans are taking cognizance of just what Elgin has to offer. Neil, lovely to have you on the show, and welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine. Talk to us about this attraction of Elgin and what it is that gets one of the greats of Stellenbosch to head over the mountains and go and find some Chardonnay grapes in Elgin to produce something special with.
Okay, Dan, thank you. Let's say, if memory serves me well, I had to spend a lot of time sort of outside the door and scratch to come in. But I think I had, let's call it, the privilege of working in Constantia in my earlier career. So not that you were so aware of it, other than once you felt that sort of climate, but Constantia for that time was obviously think if we put it into today's terms, was also very much a cooler growing environment. I just need to maybe just point out a few things that, if you're talking acquiring data or researching things, I think when you a medical doctor, you don't react to Google, you only look at clinical notes. And I mean, that is where I come from. So I think in those early days, a lot of this was sort of, I think, based on gut feel. I think we only started acquiring a lot of detailed information in the 90s. And I think that's where Andrew had, let's say, the advantage. There were people like Francois Knight who did a lot of work on identifying this. But, let's not, people like to talk cool, but never really qualifying it. But that's not important. That's not that important. I think Elgin has this wonderful ability to be able to produce wines. And we must never forget, there's only one single purpose of any wine, and that's to provide for man's enjoyment. And Chardonnay is certainly one of those varieties that has the ability let's call it, in the hands of growers and winemakers, and I regard that as a team, it has the ability to react. Andrew alluded to the hand of the winemaker, but I think I'd like to take that a step further by saying it also responds well to the respect winemakers have for the variety, and therefore understanding site, understanding exactly what is required to get the best expressions from those sites. And I think that is what Elgin has done particularly well. I had, with the help of Paul Wallace, we started planting Chardonnay for the first time in Elgin in 1990, and my very first, which was also the very first Chardonnay bottled and certified Elgin, was 94. And in fact, I mean, that was from 3 and 4 year old vines. Those wines are still actually quite alive. But again, it's can only be done where there is thorough knowledge. And, this is sort of my old trip by saying that it takes, in my book, an above average viticultural team, which also embraces winemakers, at least 10 years to understand a site or the vineyard. It would, and that before you can formulate a winemaking philosophy. Then probably you need to be trialing that within the winery for another 10 years. So people might say, Neil Ellis, you're from the wrong side of the moon, because that's 20 years. That's half your working life. But if you don't do it, you'll never know. And, you must remember, in the sciences or in nature, provided you have the knowledge, a negative result is not failure, because if you didn't do it, you wouldn't know. And, just to add to that, I think the important thing is to realize this has really been such an important foundation stone of old Europe, and specifically Burgundy. I mean, they've had the ability to hand over knowledge and experience from generation to generation. And if you don't have that, if you don't have, let's call it in today's terms, a path in place where this knowledge is shared, you're not going to get far. But I think there are really bright, really smart people who are involved in the Elgin area who I think will embrace this. And I personally only believe Elgin is now only starting to scratch its true potential.
Well, if you've got Neil Ellis looking to bring those grapes in and making Chardonnay under so famous a name, there's obviously something going right. And Neil has explained a good deal of why that is. Sarah, if I look, before we talk to you about the Masters of Wine, just the Richard Kershaw side of what you're involved with, and somebody who is, let's be charitable, say mildly obsessed with the grapes that he produces. I love listening to him. I can listen to him for hours, and the detail that he brings together. The Chardonnay that Richard gives us in its different clones and in its different iterations, drawing from what both Neil has said, what Andrew has said as well. You really seem to have found a sweet spot in Elgin in terms of finding Chardonnay that works not on anybody else's terms, but really on Elgin's terms, and is just screaming out how good the combination is of the terroir and the climate of Elgin and the people who are making the wine.
Yeah, I must say that obsession is contagious. So it's rubbed off on me a little bit. But the nice thing about Elgin is it is, as Andrew alluded to, quite a young wine region, and people are doing, all the winemakers that it's attracted are very passionate people who want to learn more. So Elgin has many factors that are just really, really exciting for a winemaker that come together perfectly for Chardonnay. So coolest wine region, we have loads and loads of cloud cover in the summertime, as well as with many different aspects within this tiny little valley, many different soil types. And the nice thing about that is as well, we get these beautiful natural acidities. And although Chardonnay can be a fairly neutral grape and a winemaker's grape, as they've said, within Elgin, you can still make it fairly naturally in that you don't have to acidulate. We've got this beautiful long hanging time, so the flavors really develop on the vines, and it's a very exciting place to be. And that's what was really exciting to show the Masters of Wine that as well. One of the things they said was it was exciting to see the focus from Elgin. We do have quite a few different grape varietals planted because, being a young wine region, people needed to learn what worked best where. And as the years have gone by, we've realized Chardonnay and Pinot Noir just work fantastically in the area. And if you buy yourself a bottle of Elgin Chard or Pinot, you'll experience that for yourself.
Although Masters of Wine had one hell of a trip, but it really did seem that Elgin stuck out for them. We'll get from Sarah what some of the more specific responses were. Let's frame this Chardonnay success story then in a more South African context. And Emil, this is a grape, and I think you and I have had this discussion a number of times, where it had such a bad impact on so many people for so long that there still remain lingering outposts of the anything but Chardonnay club. People who'd tried a glass of wine and discovered there was instead a pureed branch sitting inside their glass instead. The work that Chardonnay in South Africa, I think, has done as a whole meal, but also that Elgin has done to combine both giving the fruit the front of stage, but also doing so within this perfect, almost Burgundian climate and terroir, has allowed us to bring Chardonnay back to where I think it was always supposed to be in South Africa, and now to a place where you can serve it to people who will tell you they do not drink Chardonnay, and if they don't know you've given them a Chardonnay, they'll absolutely love it.
Hello, Dan. Nice to see you. I've never been part of the ABC crowd, and I haven't really encountered people like that. Obviously, I keep good company. But the fact is, the matter is, it's still the most planted white grape variety in the world. So it is a great white wine. Everybody loves it. It's planted in areas in the world where possibly it should not be. But the fact is, people love a great wine like a Chardonnay. But going back to Elgin, I think what I can just continue what Neil has said. Elgin wouldn't be where it was if people had not, the community of winemakers, had not really become so involved with the variety. And you need a champion for any kind of wine variety, whether it be Bayers with Pinotage or the guys are doing Stellenbosch at the moment. But I'm an outsider, unfortunately I live in Elgin, but the encounters I have with the locals, They really have placed Chardonnay on a pedestal, and the respect they show it, along with their understanding of the terroir, and also this great region that they have. I mean, it's a perfect combination. And what that's led to is that Elgin has built up a reputation for premium quality Chardonnay, and that is what makes a great grape on both fronts. One, commercially, it's the most planted white wine in the world. Secondly, it is also one of the most revered, the best, I think, and, well, if you want to, in monetary terms, the most expensive wine in the world comes from this one great grape. Now, you wouldn't be able to have this diversity of quality propositions and different expressions of Chardonnay had it not been for groupings of like-minded people who cooperate, who share information, who have their own individual desires to express their artistic merits. And I do believe winemaking is an art. They have the individual wants of expressing themselves through this grape. But as a collective body, Elgin, I don't know whether they signed some kind of agreement or what, but they said we're going to be premium, top end, nothing else. And that's why whenever there's a chance to attend a tasting of Elgin Chardonnays, I drop everything and I'm there, because you're only going to get Chardonnays of fantastic quality. And wouldn't that be great to have that for the country? Wouldn't it be great if South Africa only said to itself, we're going to have values like that? I know it's not possible, but it's a dream. And Elgin is a premium, great wine region, focusing on Chardonnay, and it's uncompromising. And people want to buy Chardonnay. The first place to look to when they want grapes is Elgin. I know that one of my clients, a Chamonix in Franschhoek. Chamonix has been replanted. They're not going to be able to harvest for the next 4 or 5 years. They've got to make Chardonnay. Where they look through for first was Elgin. It's just become ground zero for Chardonnay. But also as well, and Andrew and Neil and Sarah, you're part of the fraternity. But it really is that sharing of values that's kind of made that happen. And I really have to commend those producers, because in 40 years, they've created a wine region that I think is leading the way, one of the leaders of Chardonnay in the country, as Pinot Noir as well. And we haven't seen the end of it yet. As Neil said, I mean, I spent enough time in the cellars, and where I was with Andries and Paul Clüver's cellar 10 years ago compared to now, the different fermentation methods being used, there are different wooding regimes, there are different containers like concrete and food and so on. And what that means to me is a winemaker is restless and curious and inquisitive. And he may only be working, him or her may only be working with one variety. But there's an eternal quest for perfection. And they know they're never going to get to that perfect level, but they're going to have as much fun and as much adventure and obtain as much of a challenge and make their lives so rich by striving towards that perfection over the 40 or 50 harvests they have. And it's a fantastic region. And I don't know, I haven't got Neil or Sarah or Andrew's insights into Bockerveld shale, acidity of soils and pHs and so on. Just a bloody rugged, rough terrain. I don't think people realize that. I spent a lot of time hiking in the mountains. I spent a lot of time fishing on Steenberg Dam. Been caught up in some hectic storms. We saw the storms of late in September. Which region was hardest hit in the Cape? Arguably Elgin. It's wild country. It's wild, beautiful country. And you look at a wild, beautiful country like that, and you think about wine. You kind of, if Elgin hadn't been planted with grapes and I was sitting here now, I would be saying, listen, guys, let's go and do something. But I also have to say that do not discount the influence of the meat pie, Dan. A meat pie, obviously, the optimum culinary expression of Ireland is the meat pie. And between Howick and Peregrine Farm stalls, you've got the best roast chicken meat pies in the country, although we're trying to find out which is which. And if you haven't had a bottle of Elgin Chardonnay with a Howick or Peregrine meat pie, you're missing out on one of the great sensations, flavor sensations the world has to offer. So yes, Chardonnay is king, but do not discount the meat pie. Dan?
This from a man who has done plenty of research on both of those venues. Now, we could start an Elgin civil war by opening up the debate as to whether it's Peregrine or Hohog that has the better pie. We shall leave that for another day. We will, though, get a sense of this collective decision, Andrew, to really focus on getting the best of Chardonnay, not just from making it as well as you can, but as Emile suggests, really putting this focus on premium. It's not something you can do as an area without sitting down and discussing together and deciding, right, we as Elgin collectively are going to adopt this philosophy, and we are going to give Chardonnay a real focus, and it's going to be Chardonnay that sits on the very top shelf of anywhere that you may find it. Talk to me about this process of getting together as Elgin producers and deciding that this is where you felt you wanted to be, both in terms of making Chardonnay, but also making it in this particular space of ultra premium.
Yeah, that's a good question, Dan. And I must concur with both, well, particularly with Neil in terms of this endeavor that we are involved in. You never get to the top of the mountain. It's a constant endeavor. You just keep striving, keep learning. Obviously, you learn from fellow producers, as Emile was saying, and there you get our winemakers and viticulturists visit the great regions of the world. They go to Burgundy, they taste. And in general, that's one thing I love about the wine industry, is that there are no secrets at the end of the day. So there's lots of sharing of knowledge, but there's nothing like experience. Vine age, I think, is an important point. I know Neil's Whitehall Chardonnay is probably the oldest Chardonnay vineyard, makes fantastic wines. So I think vine age is also going to play its role. But going back to your question about how we came together, Elgin is largely a fruit growing region. And in the sort of early 90s, when barriers were dropped, there was, in fact, at one stage, only one exporter of fruit to out of South Africa, and that was a company called Unifruco. And when the ANC came to power, they abolished all the control boards. And one of the control boards was the Fruit Control Board. So overnight, you got, instead of having one exporter of fruit, and fruit was very effectively branded. I mean, Cape fruit was branded Cape. So people look forward to receiving Cape fruit, particularly in the UK markets. And overnight, instead of having one exporter, there were 300. So what happened is the bottom dropped out of the apple industry. Apple farmers had for years been riding this wave, and suddenly they were competing with each other in a way. And the only way you could compete was to introduce new varieties. And of course, the British supermarket buyers were ruthless. There's an expression, what's the difference between a British supermarket buyer and a car hijacker? You can negotiate with a car hijacker. And in fact, they put pressure on producers. Quality dropped through. You had to raise your quality. Apple farmers, when I came here, I bought what I thought was a viable apple farm. I thought I was going to be an apple farmer, and was struck with the same problem. And fortunately, as I said, I did some climate research and started planting vineyards. And what we expect, I decided that it was important to share my knowledge. And I believe, Neil, you was probably, and we included a lot, and particularly, people who were already in the business, like Neil Ellis, the Clüvers. Evan was here, David Simon, and in fact, even Michael Friedrich came to that meeting. And we all got very excited excited. An Elgin wine guild. Express commitment of all the most, that was our mantra. You know, we had to focus on quality. And in fact, there was, ironically, you know, we in the early days, we said you could plant anything but Chenin Blanc. Now, that was, I think, a bad decision because there was so much Chenin Blanc planted in South Africa. We didn't want to be competing with Chenin is also a cool climate for good examples of Chenin coming out of Elgin. Since relaxed that strict, but our focus is still on quality. And then, of course, we decided, you know, if you want to, Emile was telling you about Burgundy. I think the most wine in the world is in fact a white Burgundy. I'm not sure whether it's a Laflave or I'm not sure which, from either a Potard Montrachet. I'm not sure, but anyway, the boffin is Neil, and Emile might be able to tell me. So we decided that if you're going to be, I mean, Sauvignon Blanc is a wonderful grape, and we make great Sauvignon Blanc, but Sauvignon can only attract so much attention, and only will command a certain price. You know, I mean, I think, you know, if you look at Didier Dagenau, who makes probably the most expensive Chardonnay in the world, I think that's selling for about £100 a bottle, but a great Burgundy is a few £1,000s a bottle. So that was the idea, that we had to focus on a grape variety that would, and we'd be able to compete. Thing is that we are lot, you know, a lot by families. We're all farmers fundamentally. By our farms, so it's an important part of. But we're very much a family. I'm delighted to say we still. And flourish. And yeah, I'm very excited about the future. To get up in the morning.
All right, one or two little hiccups there, but generally a very clear sense of how this Elgin community has come together and is producing wine that is sitting very, very comfortably against Burgundy, not just in terms of its quality, but also for its price. And with Burgundy being in ever greater demand, so the Chardonnay emerging from places like Elgin is going to get plenty of attention. It did get plenty of attention with our Masters of Wine. To them in a moment. A couple of other international guests, though, are also singing the praises of Elgin. Josephine Prieur, I'm very sorry I missed Josephine's visit, such a popular member of our Dan Really Likes Wine community. Hi, Dan and Emile, sitting at the airport of Cape Town on the way back to France. I'm totally agreed with what Emile, and I wish I could have a nice glass of Elgin wine with a nice pie from the Peregrine farm. So we know which farm you like, Josephine. We'll miss the wonderful wine. I can't wait to come back. Bon, tu dois revenir très, très vite, Josephine, and a very, very warm welcome to the show. Lovely to have you on. And then Lisa Harlow, who's on her latest South African wine adventure, one of our most committed and dedicated and devoted wine ambassadors. Sorry I was late joining. Nice to hear you talking, Andrew. Guess Elgin not so cold today. The winelands have been very, very warm indeed. And that will have added, I'm sure, to the welcome just a week or so ago of all of these wine masters of wine from around the world. Sarah, give us an idea of who came to visit you and what the response was to Elgin in general and to Elgin Chardonnay in particular.
So I think it's every 4 years the Masters of Wine visits a wine region somewhere around the world and spend a week tasting wines, getting to know the different regions in that country. And this year was South Africa's turn. And they requested to come to Elgin, which we were very excited about. I think Richard may have pulled one or two strings to get them to South Africa, but I think this trip absolutely blew them away. There were 41 masters of wine from all around the world. And I think they started in Elgin, and we did a Chardonnay masterclass with Chardonnays from around the world first. And then we did a deep dive into Elgin and the Elgin Chardonnays. So they tasted about 16 different Chardonnays, and the Elgin wines really stood out. I think South African Chardonnay in general is doing an amazing job, and it's been interesting to learn about the evolution of Chardonnay in South Africa, and to actually experience it with wines in front of us was very exciting. But one of the things that kept coming up was the fact that Elgin had so much focus. And I think that shows quite a few of the wines and quite a few of the winemakers have single site wines. And wine and winemaking is one of those things where you start learning and you learn more and more, and then the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. So I think the Elgin farmers have this great yearning to understand their site better. And as I mentioned earlier, Elgin has so many different soils, different aspects, different altitudes. We've got the Groenlandberg mountain in the north of Elgin, which has constant cloud cover and a little bit of altitude. Then we've got the south of Elgin where Andrew is, which is, I think, Andrew, some of your vines are only 4 km from the sea, so they get morning fogs. And then the western side of Elgin gets more rain than London does most years. And then the eastern side of Elgin is a little bit drier. So we've got so many different variables to work with. And it was really nice tasting through the wines with the Masters of Wine to sort of show the thought process of how we want to first understand the soils, the terroir, because the terroir is ultimately what's going to shape your wine, I think. And then what Richard likes to focus on quite a lot is the different Chardonnay clones that you use. That's sort of the cherry on the top. It's honing your wines even more. But then you want to understand how the different clones' flavor profiles change depending on the soils that they're grown on. So within Elgin, we've got mostly Bokkerveld shale and Table Mountain sandstone. And it was great to have people from overseas here in Elgin, because I think most people just drive straight through Elgin without spending too much time here. And there's actually so much to see. It was nice to be able to show them at Paul Clüver the different types of soils, and then go through to Iona, and there was a huge difference there as well. And the soils that they get there. Yeah, so I think they were absolutely blown away, and Elgin Chardonnay is really putting itself on the map at the moment.
As a very quick follow-up, and it's ridiculous that we're already 40-odd minutes into this conversation. There's so much we can talk about in this space, but that sense of using the clones with which Richard is I think, understanding of like nobody else, and tapping into your terroir. I think it's fair to say that parallel with Burgundy is now very much spoken of as a kind of well, they also make similar stuff to what we do, as opposed to we in Elgin are trying to be Burgundy. This is very much Elgin on Elgin's terms, making Elgin's wine.
Yeah, very much so. It's as much as you want to do comparisons between Elgin and Burgundy, you can't really. It's two very different places to farm. Elgin's a very difficult place to farm as well. As I mentioned, some years we get more rain than London. And it's, as you mentioned, wild country, and the comparisons are a nice way to give people context of where they can fit Elgin in around the world, but we are absolutely uniquely Elgin. And I think the goal of most of the winemakers here are to, and it might be cliche to say that, but are to express the terroir in the most honest way possible. And as I mentioned earlier, with Elgin, we get these beautiful natural acidities, we get this minerality, we get incredible citrus notes as well. And we can do that with very minimal intervention, whereas some other regions around the world need to use a lot of oak. They need to pick far too early in order to retain that acidity, but then they're lacking in those flavors. Whereas we can leave the grapes. We've got one of the longest hanging times in South Africa. We're always last to start harvesting, and that's got amazing benefits to making wine in a more natural way. So we also have very high, normally we have very high nitrogen, or YANs, yeast assimilable nitrogen. So we can do natural fermentations and be pretty much guaranteed with a dry wine, but I'm starting to digress. But if you look at the Cape Floral Kingdom, we are almost in the heart of the Cape Floral Kingdom, and we've got something that is completely endemic to Elgin called the Elgin Marsh Rose, and it's absolutely beautiful, but it's also such a beautiful representation of the uniqueness of Elgin. It can only grow in Elgin. Out of anywhere in the world, it can only grow here, and that, I feel like that's quite a testament to the Elgin region. We've got quite acidic soils as well. So the diversity of the Cape Floral Kingdom, I don't know if Neil and the others will agree, I'm getting a bit airy-fairy here. But the diversity of the Cape Floral Kingdom is also one of the reasons why our region is so unique for Chardonnay, for this incredible Chardonnay that we can make.
Ronell Hewitt is watching the show. Thank you for this. Neil Ellis Wines, Iona and Richard Kershaw. Wow, some big guns, excuse the pun you have there. That's terrible, Ronell. Finish your glass of wine. I just love Elgin's wine. Truly special. It is indeed. Ronell, thank you for joining us on the show. If we then take all of this splendor of Elgin Chardonnay, Neil, and try and place it somewhere on the broader map of South African success stories, as somebody who's been responsible for so many of those success stories, and some of the finest Stellenbosch cabs in particular, on a long list of which the Neil Ellis hand has guided South African triumphs. Where is the Chardonnay of Elgin sitting in terms of the great wine regions, the great wines that we've been making over the years?
Dan, yeah, it's a question that one could either spend hours on trying to answer it, but we don't have that amount of time. So I just think, I mean, all my colleagues have mentioned to you, you probably within that got some of the answers, but I think the one important thing is that we must never forget, you know, it's all fine to talk about the influence of environment, the influence of the plant, but there's also the influence of person. And if I could, I'd just like to start with not a warning, but, you know, my own experiences of Burgundy are that even neighbors, they probably rarely spend any time in each other's wineries. But what would happen is when the label product leaves the winery door or the cellar door, they stand together like blood brothers. And that makes them so powerful internationally. We unfortunately still have, by nature, let's say part of our DNA is that we tend to want to go it alone. Going it alone internationally, you won't get time a day. And I think Elgin, just has the makeup of people, just really honest, good folk who don't mind sharing a platform. And yeah, let's use the term, talk each other up, but in an honest way. I mean, you're only reflecting the truth. And I think Elgin, because still it's I think in global terms, in terms of time, we're very much in our infancy. But I think South Africans, by and large, have the ability to play this, let's call it this catch-up game, very, very quickly. And, you know, as winemakers, we all have friends in different parts of the world. And one of the things that is always spoken about is the quality of Chardonnay from this country, and more specifically, how they enjoy, let's call it the stylistic interpretations of what Elgin is capable of. And I think this is testimony really to a fantastic environment and to people who have the ability to interpret that and more so, who really passionate. I mean, I listened to Sarah just now. I mean, I haven't got glasses on, but I don't think Sarah's still young. But, you know, if I can just sense the importance of not only Elgin, but I mean, just everything that wraps around that. She's got that. But yeah, I think also what I've also found is that really, let's call it smart tables of restaurants and chefs globally are also starting to watch and mention and talk and ask and have tasted these wines. And I mean, you know, it's also one of these wines. Again, Chardonnay has the ability to be producing wine that is just so perfectly styled for enjoyment, but equally so work tremendously well with food. And I think our winemakers, besides their ability to understand wine, also really enjoy this interaction with fine tables. And I think that is where I like to refer to that as a revolution, because I mean, revolutions never happen within the winery walls. That happens in vineyards, that happens in wine shops, happens with wine writers, the restaurateurs. And Elgin Chard is obviously one of those wines that sort of carries itself very highly in those circles. So I just think if we're talking international appeal, it's right up there. And as I say again, it's hardly started.
Well, that leads me into the question I wanted to speak to Emile about as we wrap up what I suspect will have to be the first of several conversations in this space, because an hour has absolutely flown by. Emile, when we were together in person last time, it was at Paul Clüver. It was the launch of the Seven Flags, and it was on the back of Andries Berger, winemaker extraordinaire now for I think he's been there since they discovered Elgin, really, producing a wine that received a world championship medal, best Chardonnay in the world. It was an extraordinary accolade for this wine. Great for Andries, great for Paul Clüver as a brand, but also really important for South Africa. Neil reckons we're only just getting going. How much does this kind of award mean to South African wine? What does it say about where our Chardonnay is? And do you agree that this Chardonnay story is, even though going really well, still very much in its infancy?
Yes, infancy, yes. So I think that's 40 years says enough. So your answer to that question is resoundingly yes. The Chardonnay Masters results have come out, and Paul Clüver also won 2 gold medals and 1 Masters award there. So two things on that. Concerning the vision of Elgin producers, what struck me about the community, the winemaking community, is they think globally. They visit people overseas. They go to extra lengths to court the media. They have the wine masters here. WOSA had an international sommeliers grouping, also focusing on Elgin Chardonnay. And in South Africa, premium producers are running out of time in South Africa. We're making more premium wine than the local population is able to suck up, if I may be so crudely. We have to think globally in this country. We have to think premium, and we have to think region. And if you tie those knots together, Elgin has got what it takes. There's global ambitions. The people see that. They're not only thinking locally. They're performing exceptionally well in overseas competitions. And local competitions, days are almost dead. Diddly squat. They mean nothing. They mean nothing for the local, for the bigger thing of wine in South Africa, because we as consumers are looking at global scores. I'm looking at Decanter and not Veritas or one of these local competitions, and I can get access to global insights about wine judged by international panels in Europe and America with huge audiences, huge entrances, and that means much more for the producer than local competitions. So forget about local competitions, think globally, global accolades, That's where you are. So many people I've spoken to about how do we get South African wines on the top shelf at a decent price of 30, 40, 50 pounds. And one of the things that comes up is performing in Decanter or Wine Spectator, one of those platforms. That's the competition side of things. But I really think the people in Elgin, and they're fortunate because it's quite a limited amount of producers. I don't think there are more than 20 members even, but they really have global ambitions. And that's very important. Global ambitions, but Elgin, South Africa heart, and Chardonnay. And you put those three together, Elgin is really in position to lead the way as not a Chardonnay offering, not a South African offering, but a premium regional brand. And today, and I'm involved in the communications game in my days of writing 600-word press releases. I'm just hanging on there, I'm just hanging in there because people want brands, they want succinct information, they want sweet spots, they want bells and whistles. And Elgin Chardonnay ticks all the right boxes for that. And I think the forces in the Elgin route are there to make that happen and take it further. And the way they've thought globally about marketing themselves has really been commendable. And it is one of the reasons for the success. And I think it's one of the reasons for the success going forward. Dan?
I think your endorsement from international producing, international judges, international competitions, magazines, publications is huge. I also think the local endorsement is huge from not necessarily the local competitions, although I don't discount that, but the fact that people like Neil Ellis are going shopping over the mountain, people like Radford Dale are putting money and time into Elgin. It really is becoming a hotspot. And I think it has the added benefit, as we've seen from all four of our guests today, of being a place that clearly elicits a great deal of passion in terms of the production of wine. So to Andrew and to Sarah and to Neil and to Emil, guys, thank you all. I'm not sure where that hour went because we seem to just got started and already we're done. I think we might have to have another look at this, and I suspect it won't be too long before Christine sends me another email saying, well, we've just won another 35 awards. We need to have another show. Elgin. And I think the one that I want to talk about is some of the more detail on the Chardonnay itself, this ability to age and how there are these little pockets of Elgin where you guys as producers are able to offer these subtle but important variations on such wonderful wine. But for now, thank you. I have wine from all of you, which is going to get due attention over the next few weeks as I lead into Christmas and hopefully take the sting out of my turkey as everybody else pretends to enjoy it. But Andrew, thank you very, very much indeed. To Sarah, thank you. And that beaming smile would suggest married life is going particularly well. I think it was just before your wedding when I saw you last in person. And Neil, lovely to have you on the show and joining us. And Emil, as always, a fountain of South African wine wisdom. So guys, to all of you, raising a glass to Elgin from the depths of Johannesburg. Keep making wonderful wine. And I think the key part of what you're doing collectively is doing us proud as South African wine, but also showing the ability to move together in the manner that Neil has suggested and really working as a team, taking a pretty small region and punching well above your weight around the world. And that is most admirable and wonderful for us to see as an industry. So to all of you, thank you. Have a fabulous evening. Wash the show down with several gallons of Chardonnay and look forward to more Elgin celebrations on Dan Really Likes Wine soon. So thank you all.
Thank you, Dan.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
So here we go.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, guys.
The masters of wine dropping in on Elgin and walking away with huge smiles and a new discovered love of Elgin Chardonnay and a few other grapes, I suspect, led by Pinot Noir. But also to Neil Ellis, one of the Stellenbosch great South African greats, Andrew Gunn up at Iona, Emil and Sarah, thank you all for being part of today's show. I'll be joining you from Leopard Creek on Monday as we build towards Christmas and start looking at wine to buy people for Christmas, wine to drink with your Christmas lunch, and just wine to take the sting out of what's been a pretty long year for everybody. Thank you to the Elgin team and to Christine Lundy in particular for setting up today. This is Dan Really Likes Wine, brought to you by Norman Goodfellows. I have guests at a wine dinner waiting, so I'm shooting off. I suspect there might be some Elgin Chardonnay squeezed into that lineup. Have a great evening. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.